September 15th, 1943. Stalag Luft III, Sagan, Germany. Commandant Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindeiner Wildau stood before the newly completed South Compound, hands clasped behind his back in the manner of old Prussian officers who believed in order and dignity. The compound stretched across 24 hectares of sandy soil, surrounded by double barbed wire fences, watchtowers positioned every 100 meters, seismographs buried beneath the earth to detect tunneling vibrations, and microphones planted near the perimeter. It was, von Lindeiner believed, the most sophisticated prisoner of war camp ever constructed. The bright yellow sand would expose any tunnel immediately. The elevated guard towers provided complete visual coverage. The technology would detect any underground activity before a shovel could dig 3 meters. And yet, the commandant's pride extended beyond mere security architecture. This was a camp designed to fulfill the letter and spirit of the Geneva Convention. Officers would receive their monthly pay in Lagergeld, the camp's internal currency. Red Cross parcels would arrive regularly. Prisoners could purchase weak beer quarterly. There would be books, sports fields, theatrical performances. Von Lindeiner, a career officer who privately despised the Nazi regime, believed profoundly in the code of military honor that transcended ideology. These American and British airmen were fellow aviators, men who had chosen the same dangerous profession, who understood the terrible beauty of flight and the random cruelty of anti-aircraft fire. They deserved respect. As he watched the first transport of American officers from the 8th Air Force march through the gates, exhausted men with hollow eyes and torn uniforms, von Lindeiner turned to his adjutant and spoke words that encapsulated his philosophy. "We have constructed a facility that meets every requirement of the Geneva Convention. The prisoners have adequate housing, rations supplemented by the Red Cross, recreational activities. In exchange, we expect them to recognize this civilized treatment and refrain from unnecessary trouble. Order and respect, these are the foundations of proper military conduct, even in captivity." What von Lindeiner failed to comprehend was that by providing the minimum resources required by international law and relative freedom from brutality, he had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for one of history's most remarkable social experiments. The Kriegies, their self-adopted nickname derived from the German word Kriegsgefangene, prisoner of war, would not passively await liberation. Instead, they would construct a sophisticated self-organized society that transformed captivity into a laboratory of human ingenuity and psychological resistance. This was not merely survival. This was the absolute refusal to be dehumanized through the deliberate creation of normalcy, commerce, education, culture, and organized resistance. The mathematics of this unlikely civilization began with arithmetic so simple, it seemed absurd to call it an economy. Every week, the International Committee of the Red Cross delivered standardized parcels to Stalag Luft III and other camps holding Western Allied prisoners. Each parcel contained tin cans of Spam, condensed milk, butter, jam, chocolate bars, coffee, biscuits, and 50 cigarettes, typically Lucky Strike, Camel, or Chesterfield brands. These items were distributed equally among prisoners, but equality of distribution did not mean equality of desire. Some men craved tobacco desperately. Others, non-smokers or men saving their lungs for whatever uncertain future awaited, viewed cigarettes as worthless paper tubes. Within days of the first Red Cross deliveries in 1942, cigarettes began circulating as currency. The transformation was spontaneous and inevitable, driven by the fundamental economic reality that all human societies face, the necessity of allocating scarce resources among individuals with differing preferences. Cigarettes possessed every quality classical economists attributed to functional money. They were divisible. A single cigarette became the basic unit of account. They were durable enough, lasting weeks without significant deterioration. They were portable. And, crucially, they held universal demand. Smokers wanted them for consumption. Non-smokers recognized their exchange value. By 1943, when the South Compound opened to house the growing population of captured American airmen, the cigarette economy had matured into startling sophistication. Exchange rates emerged organically, and fluctuated based on supply and demand. One chocolate bar traded for 8 to 12 cigarettes depending on recent parcel deliveries. One tin of Spam commanded 15 to 20 cigarettes. The weak German beer sold quarterly in the canteen, a pale, watery liquid prisoners mocked as dishwater with ambition, nevertheless fetched 50 to 100 cigarettes per bottle when supply was limited. Inflation occurred when Red Cross shipments increased suddenly, flooding the market with tobacco and reducing the relative value of each cigarette. Deflation struck when shipments were delayed, creating scarcity that drove prices upward. And when rumors spread of impending German inspections or confiscations, the economy experienced phenomena identical to those that collapsed banks in the outside world. Panic selling, hoarding runs on informal banks where men stored surplus goods. The camp held approximately 2,500 British RAF officers by early 1943, with American numbers swelling to 7,500 by 1944 as the 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign over Germany intensified and Luftwaffe fighters exacted their toll. Nearly 11,000 Allied prisoners lived in Stalag Luft III at its peak capacity, crammed into wooden barracks, sleeping on triple-decker bunks, subsisting on German rations so meager they provided perhaps 200 calories daily, supplemented only by those precious Red Cross parcels that meant the difference between slow starvation and functional survival. The true revolution, however, was not merely that cigarettes became money. The revolution was what prisoners built with that money, an entire civilization that refused to accept that captivity meant the end of human aspiration. Lieutenant R.A. Radford, a British officer captured in North Africa, arrived at Stalag Luft III in 1943 after internment in Italian camps that had surrendered following Mussolini's overthrow. Radford was a trained economist from Cambridge University, and what he witnessed behind barbed wire fascinated him with the clinical precision of an academic observing laboratory conditions. He began taking notes meticulously, documenting every economic transaction, every price fluctuation, every instance of arbitrage or speculation or panic. Radford observed that certain prisoners emerged naturally as traders, men who facilitated exchanges between parties for a small commission, typically 1 or 2 cigarettes per transaction. These traders performed essential market functions, reducing transaction costs and information asymmetries. If a prisoner in Block 104 desperately wanted chocolate, but only possessed coffee, and another prisoner in Block 109 desired the opposite, the trader would broker the exchange, walking between barracks and taking his cut. This was not exploitation, it was value creation through information and logistics. Arbitrage opportunities emerged constantly. If chocolate traded for 10 cigarettes in the British compounds but 12 cigarettes in the American compounds, an enterprising trader would buy low and sell high, pocketing the difference until market forces equalized the prices. The camp even developed credit systems and savings mechanisms. Prisoners who received regular private parcels from family, packages containing extra cigarettes, chocolate, or toiletries, became informal bankers, lending goods to others with the expectation of repayment with interest when future parcels arrived. Defaults occurred. Disputes arose. The camp's senior Allied officers established informal arbitration systems to resolve commercial conflicts. But the most dramatic economic phenomena occurred during supply shocks. In March 1944, Red Cross deliveries were interrupted for 3 weeks due to transportation disruptions as Allied bombing intensified German rail networks. The cigarette supply contracted sharply. Prices exploded. One chocolate bar, previously valued at 10 cigarettes, suddenly commanded 30. Hoarding became rampant. Men who had accumulated tobacco reserves watched their wealth appreciate dramatically. Smokers, facing withdrawal and emptied stocks, grew desperate, offering valuable items for single cigarettes. Then, in early April, a massive shipment arrived, weeks of delayed parcels delivered simultaneously. The market was flooded. Inflation struck brutally. Within days, chocolate prices collapsed to 6 cigarettes per bar. Men who had hoarded cigarettes expecting continued scarcity suddenly held depreciated currency. The market corrected, and equilibrium slowly restored. Radford documented all of it. After liberation in 1945, He published his observations in the journal Economica under the title, The Economic Organization of a POW Camp. The paper became an instant classic of economic literature, used in university courses for decades afterward as a perfect case study of spontaneous market emergence. Radford had proven empirically what economists theorized abstractly, that markets arise naturally wherever humans need to allocate scarce resources, even in prison camps where the total wealth was measured in canned meat and tobacco. But the economy was only one dimension of the civilization the Kriegies constructed. The second pillar was education. Captain James Deans, a Scottish officer who became the camp's unofficial Minister of Education, recognized immediately that the greatest threat to prisoners was not malnutrition or disease. It was psychological disintegration. Men in their early 20s, shot down over enemy territory, faced an indefinite sentence in captivity with no certainty of liberation, no knowledge of whether the war would last 1 year or 10, no guarantee they would survive to see freedom. Depression was epidemic. Suicide was discussed in quiet conversations late at night. Insanity hovered at the edges of consciousness. Deans proposed the solution, the University of Stalag Luft III. The concept was audacious in its ambition. Using the expertise of prisoners who had been professors, engineers, lawyers, accountants, and teachers in civilian life, the camp would offer formal courses in dozens of subjects. Classes would meet daily in barracks using improvised blackboards made from painted wood, textbooks ordered through the Red Cross and YMCA, and lecture notes transcribed meticulously by students. The curriculum was astonishingly comprehensive. Engineering courses covered mechanical, civil, and electrical disciplines, teaching principles of thermodynamics, structural analysis, and circuit design. Language classes offered instruction in German, French, Russian, Italian, and Spanish, skills that might prove useful for escape attempts and would certainly prove valuable in post-war careers. Accounting courses prepared men for business careers. Law classes, taught by captured barristers and solicitors, covered contracts, torts, and criminal procedure. Mathematics, history, literature, philosophy. The university offered everything except laboratory sciences, which required equipment unavailable behind wire. Examinations were administered formally, proctored by academic prisoners who maintained standards as rigorously as any civilian university. The International Red Cross and YMCA facilitated communication with universities in Britain and America, which agreed under special wartime provisions to recognize credits earned in captivity. Hundreds of prisoners completed substantial coursework during their internment. Some earned complete degrees. A master from King's College, Cambridge, himself a prisoner at Stalag Luft III, supervised examinations and certified results that would be accepted by British universities after the war. The library became the intellectual heart of the camp. Through Red Cross channels and donations, prisoners accumulated more than 10,000 books, fiction, non-fiction, technical manuals, classics of literature and philosophy. Men who had never read Shakespeare discovered Hamlet and King Lear. Engineers studied texts on aerodynamics and structural mechanics, preparing for post-war careers in aviation. The library operated with formal checkout systems, late fees paid in cigarettes, and fierce debates about what new books to request in the next Red Cross order. This was resistance of a profound kind, the refusal to allow captivity to halt intellectual development. The Nazis could imprison bodies, but they could not imprison minds that insisted on learning, growing, and preparing for a future beyond barbed wire. Yet education and economics alone did not constitute a complete civilization. The third pillar was culture. Theater became the beating heart of the camp's cultural life. The Germans, perhaps sensing that theatrical performances would occupy prisoners' time and energy harmlessly, provided basic materials: wood for constructing a stage, fabrics for costumes, paint for scenery. What they failed to anticipate was the sophistication and psychological importance of what prisoners would create. Productions were elaborate and disciplined. Prisoners staged Shakespeare's plays, Hamlet, Macbeth, Romeo, and Juliet, with men playing female roles using wigs fashioned from unraveled wool and dresses sewn from dyed bed sheets. The performances were not amateurish parodies but serious artistic endeavors. Some prisoners had professional acting experience. Others discovered talent they never knew they possessed. Rehearsals consumed weeks. Opening nights drew hundreds of spectators packed into makeshift theaters, men sitting on benches and floors, desperate for 2 hours of escape into Elsinore or Verona, or the Scottish Heath. Musical theater thrived. Prisoners mounted productions of contemporary Broadway shows they remembered from before the war, reconstructing songs and dialogue from collective memory. Orchestras formed, using instruments donated by the Red Cross and YMCA: violins, cellos, trumpets, clarinets. Men who had been professional musicians before the war conducted performances of Beethoven, Mozart, and Brahms. The incongruity was staggering. Classical symphonies performed in wooden barracks surrounded by guard towers and machine guns, Bach fugues echoing across barbed wire as searchlights swept the perimeter at night. This was not escapism. This was defiance. Every theatrical performance, every concert, every poetry reading was an assertion that prisoners remained fully human despite Nazi efforts to reduce them to numbers. Culture was resistance. Art was refusal. Beauty was rebellion against dehumanization. Newspapers circulated within the camp, handwritten or typed on contraband typewriters, containing news gathered from secret radios, poetry composed by prisoners, satirical cartoons mocking German guards, and classified ads where men advertised goods for sale in the cigarette economy. Sports leagues organized football, cricket, and volleyball tournaments, with formal standings, referees, and championship trophies fashioned from scrap metal. Men built makeshift gymnasiums where they exercised obsessively, maintaining physical fitness as both health measure and psychological discipline. But beneath all this visible activity, the commerce, the education, the culture, ran the fourth and most dangerous pillar of Kriegies civilization: organized resistance. The X organization, run initially by British squadron leader Roger Bushell, coordinated all escape activities. The organization operated with military discipline and sophisticated compartmentalization. Hundreds of prisoners participated in various roles, most knowing only their specific assignment to prevent German infiltration from compromising the entire operation. Forgers produced fake identity papers, travel documents, and passes using primitive materials: ink made from crushed pencil lead and boot polish, paper stolen from German offices, typewriters smuggled piece by piece. Tailors converted uniforms into civilian clothing, dyeing fabrics with ersatz chemicals and cutting patterns from memory. Map makers traced detailed charts of the surrounding region from atlases in the library and information provided by newly arrived prisoners. Compass manufacturers built navigation devices from scavenged materials, magnetized slivers of metal, watch crystals, paper dials. But the most ambitious undertaking was tunnel construction. Prisoners dug multiple tunnels simultaneously, named Tom, Dick, and Harry with deliberate English understatement. The tunnels descended 9 meters below the surface to pass beneath the seismograph detectors, then extended hundreds of meters horizontally toward the forest beyond the wire. The engineering was remarkable. Wooden shoring prevented collapse. Ventilation systems using bellows made from kit bags pumped air to diggers working in claustrophobic darkness. Electric lighting was powered by tapping into camp power lines. Disposal of excavated sand, bright yellow and instantly recognizable, was the greatest challenge. Prisoners fashioned ingenious devices: bags suspended inside trouser legs, released by pins to dribble sand gradually as men walked around the compound. The sand was scattered on gardens, mixed with darker topsoil, dispersed across the camp in quantities small enough to avoid detection. This required thousands of trips by hundreds of men over months. And protecting all this activity was the duty pilot system, perhaps the most sophisticated surveillance operation prisoners ever mounted against their captors. The system worked with mechanical precision. Designated prisoners, rotating in shifts, positioned themselves at strategic observation points around the compound. They tracked every German guard's entrance, movement, and exit, recording the information in detailed logs. A guard entering the compound at the main gate would be noted immediately. His position would be updated continuously as he moved between barracks. Other prisoners, casually standing or walking nearby, would signal his approach to areas where clandestine activities were underway. Tunneling, radio operation, forgery work, intelligence gathering. Hand signals, verbal codes, and visual markers allowed nearly instantaneous communication across the camp. The irony was magnificent. German guards became so accustomed to the system that they sometimes consulted the duty pilot logs themselves to verify the whereabouts of their own personnel. Von Lindeiner once used the log to identify 2 guards who had abandoned their posts early, an incident that resulted in disciplinary action. The prisoners had created a surveillance apparatus so efficient that even their captors relied on it. The culmination of the X organization's efforts came in March 1944. On the night of March 24, 25, 76 prisoners escaped through Tunnel Harry during a mass breakout that became legendary as the Great Escape. The tunnel had taken a year to construct, extending more than 100 meters beyond the wire. The escape was partially successful. 76 men reached the forest, but ultimately tragic. Only 3 escapees reached neutral territory successfully. 50 were recaptured and executed by the Gestapo on Hitler's direct orders, murdered in groups along roadsides in flagrant violation of the Geneva Convention. 23 were returned to captivity. The massacre shocked the camp. Von Lindeiner, who had opposed the executions and had treated prisoners honorably according to the old Prussian military code, was arrested by the Gestapo and imprisoned for negligence. The commandant's tragedy was bitter irony. He was punished precisely because his relatively humane administration had made the escape possible. Yet even after the Great Escape and its terrible aftermath, even after the SS and Gestapo increased security and von Lindeiner's successors imposed harsher restrictions, the fundamental structure of Kriegies civilization endured. The economy continued. Classes met. Plays were performed. Men studied engineering and law, traded chocolate for cigarettes, played football, published newspapers, and planned future escapes with undimmed determination. And hidden within this apparent normalcy operated one of the war's most remarkable intelligence operations. Flight Lieutenant Howard Kundell, a British radar observer from the Telecommunications Research Establishment, possessed knowledge of ultra-secret British radar technology. After his capture, he became determined to continue serving despite captivity. Using components smuggled into camp gradually over months, wire scavenged from German electrical systems, vacuum tubes obtained through bribery, crystals from broken radios, Kundell constructed a functioning transmitter. With this device operating from hiding places within barracks and moving frequently to avoid German radio detection equipment, Kundell established direct contact with British intelligence in London. The information he transmitted was invaluable. Newly captured airmen arrived at Stalag Luft III weekly, men shot down days or weeks earlier who possessed current intelligence about German air defenses. Kundell debriefed them systematically. What radar systems had they encountered? What frequencies were German night fighters using? What new flak positions had appeared around industrial targets? Where were ammunition depots located? This intelligence was encoded and transmitted to London, where it informed RAF and USAF bombing strategy. Kundell's radio operated for years, undetected despite German counterintelligence efforts. Even during the chaotic final months of the war, when German forces evacuated Stalag Luft III ahead of the advancing Red Army and prisoners were force-marched westward in brutal winter conditions, Kundell carried his transmitter components and continued operations. This was resistance at its most sophisticated, prisoners contributing directly to the Allied war effort from within captivity, turning their imprisonment into an intelligence asset. The Nazis had created concentration points of Allied military expertise and inadvertently established information collection nodes behind their own lines. January 27, 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Albert P. Clark, the senior American officer at Stalag Luft III, stood in the center of the South Compound as von Lindeiner's successor delivered the evacuation order. The Red Army was 100 kilometers east and advancing rapidly. All prisoners would march west within hours, taking only what they could carry. Clark looked around at the compound that had been his world for nearly 2 years. The library with its 10,000 books, shelves of knowledge that would be abandoned or burned. The theater stage where Hamlet had been performed 6 weeks earlier. The Prince of Denmark's existential agony, rendered by an American bombardier wearing a homemade doublet. The blackboard in Block 109 where an engineering class had ended mid-lecture yesterday. Half an equation still visible in chalk. The formula for calculating load-bearing stress on steel beams, a calculation that might help someone build a bridge or a building in whatever world awaited after liberation. The duty pilot logbook, its pages filled with thousands of entries documenting every German guard's movements over 3 years. A monument to obsessive organization and collective vigilance. Clark had arrived at Stalag Luft III as a 23-year-old first lieutenant, shot down over France during his 9th mission. He was leaving as a 25-year-old lieutenant colonel, educated in subjects he had never studied before captivity, fluent in German he had learned from fellow prisoners, and profoundly transformed by the experience of watching men create civilization from nothing. Around him, nearly 8,000 American prisoners prepared for the march, packing meager possessions into improvised rucksacks. Many had spent their entire captivity here, years of their youth consumed by barbed wire and guard towers. Yet Clark recognized something remarkable. These men were not broken. They had not been dehumanized. They had maintained discipline, education, culture, commerce, and resistance, despite every effort to reduce them to passive, defeated numbers. The paradox struck Clark with the force of revelation. The Germans had provided minimum resources expecting passive conformity. Instead, prisoners had transformed those resources into tools of active resistance. Books meant for entertainment became university curricula. Cigarettes meant as comfort became functioning currency. Time meant to be endured and boredom became opportunity for tunneling, forging, intelligence gathering, and cultural creation. Every concession to humanity the Germans had made, required by Geneva Convention and honored by von Lindeiner's old-fashioned sense of military honor, became foundation for resistance. The lesson was profound and permanent. You cannot imprison the body without inevitably liberating the mind, and a liberated mind will always find methods of defiance, not through violence, but through absolute refusal to accept dehumanization. When the Red Army liberated Stalag Luft III's remaining prisoners in late January 1945, and American and British forces freed those who had survived the forced marches west, the statistics of the Kriegies civilization could finally be calculated with historical precision. At peak capacity, Stalag Luft III held 10,949 prisoners, approximately 2,500 Royal Air Force officers, 7,500 United States Army Air Force officers, and 900 personnel from other allied nations, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and occupied European countries. The mortality rate in Stalag Luft III and similar camps holding Western Allied officer prisoners was dramatically lower than in camps holding enlisted men or in Japanese camps in the Pacific Theater. Prisoners of the Japanese endured mortality rates of 27% or higher, dying from starvation, disease, torture, and arbitrary execution. At Stalag Luft III, the mortality rate for the period 1942-1945, excluding the 50 officers murdered after the Great Escape, was approximately 2%. Deaths primarily from illness, accidents, and bombing raids during the final chaotic months. This disparity was not accidental. It reflected the direct consequence of the Geneva Convention's protections when honored, even imperfectly, versus their complete abandonment. The cigarette economy that R.A. Radford documented so meticulously proved more than an interesting historical curiosity. His paper, The Economic Organization of a POW Camp, published in Economica in November 1945, became a foundational text in economics, assigned in university courses 80 years later. Radford had provided empirical proof of spontaneous market emergence, demonstrating that complex economic systems arise naturally from human need to allocate scarce resources, requiring no central planning or formal institutions. Markets, Radford proved, are not artificial constructions imposed by governments or economists, but organic phenomena that emerge wherever humans exist in sufficient numbers with differing preferences and tradable goods. The lessons extended far beyond academic economics into practical policy. Post-war treatment of prisoners and refugees was influenced by Stalag Luft III's example. When the Geneva Conventions were revised and expanded in 1949, the evidence that relatively humane treatment produced better outcomes for both captors and captives informed the negotiations. The hundreds of prisoners who completed university coursework during captivity returned to civilian life with credentials that launched successful careers. Engineers who had studied in barracks went on to design aircraft, bridges, and buildings. Lawyers who had learned contract law from captured barristers established practices. Accountants who had studied bookkeeping between morning and evening roll calls built businesses. The education was not merely time-filling distraction, but practical preparation for post-war life, transforming potentially wasted years into productive investment in human capital. The cultural legacy endured in unexpected ways. Veterans of Stalag Luft III formed associations that met annually for decades, maintaining friendships forged in captivity. They published memoirs, gave interviews, and ensured the historical record preserved not only the famous Great Escape, but the entire remarkable civilization they had constructed. Museums were established near the former campsite, now in Poland following post-war border adjustments. The theatrical productions, the orchestral performances, the athletic competitions, all were remembered as essential elements of psychological survival, proof that culture is not luxury, but fundamental human necessity. Yet perhaps the deepest legacy was philosophical. In post-war interrogations and memoirs, German officers acknowledged their fundamental miscalculation. General der Flieger Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated fighter pilots and a senior commander, reflected in his memoir, The First and the Last, on the broader strategic blindness that Stalag Luft III exemplified on microcosm level. We underestimated not merely American industrial capacity, but American character. We assumed that soldiers raised in comfort and democracy would lack discipline and resilience. We believed that prisoners provided with books and sports would remain passive. We were wrong on every count. The Americans and British proved that democratic societies produce not weakness, but a different kind of strength. The ability to organize voluntarily, to resist creatively, to maintain morale without authoritarian compulsion. This was the war's central lesson, and we failed to learn it until defeat taught us. Von Lindeiner himself, released from imprisonment after the war ended, gave a rare interview in 1946 where he reflected on his experience commanding Stalag Luft III. I treated the prisoners as the Geneva Convention required and as my conscience demanded. I believed that providing civilized conditions would produce civilized behavior. In one sense, I was correct. The prisoners behaved with remarkable discipline and organization. But I failed to understand that every comfort I provided, every book I allowed, every Red Cross parcel I distributed became a tool they used not for passive acceptance, but for active resistance. They built an economy from cigarettes, a university from textbooks, a theater from scraps, and an escape organization from determination. The lesson is humbling. Civilization cannot be contained. It will emerge even in prison camps because it is not a luxury of freedom, but an essential expression of humanity itself. Lieutenant Colonel Albert P. Clark, in a speech delivered to returning American prisoners at a reception in 1945, articulated what many Kriegies felt but struggled to express. Stalag Luft III was the strangest war we ever fought. We were imprisoned, yet we built a society more organized than many free cities. We were deprived of liberty, yet we created an economy, a university, theaters, newspapers, sports leagues, and an intelligence operation that contributed to Allied victory. We were supposed to be broken by captivity. Instead, we proved that the human spirit, when confronted with attempts at dehumanization, responds not with surrender but with an insistence on remaining fully human. That was our victory, not escape, though we tried. Not liberation, though it came eventually, but the daily victory of refusing to be reduced to numbers in German record books. Every class attended, every play performed, every cigarette traded, every tunnel dug was an act of resistance. Civilization is not something granted by governments or guaranteed by freedom. Civilization is what humans create spontaneously whenever they are gathered together, even behind barbed wire, even under guard towers, even facing uncertain futures. That is the permanent lesson of Stalag Luft III.